as I said before, my name is Alyssa Brooks, and I'm a graduate assistant here at IU Cinema. And I was recruited to moderate this discussion because I have a Bachelor of Music and Voice Performance. So I have a lot of experience thinking about the nuances of the sound of my voice and how I can manipulate that with technique and how it sounds when recorded. So I was really excited to learn about sound in film, whether it be voice or sound effects, and the technological side of it as well. So I can't wait to hear more about that from our experts here. So let me introduce to you again Jessica Davis Tagg, musicologist and recording producer, Jamie Tagg, our audio engineer, and Tony Brewer, our Foley artist. Please join me in welcoming our guests. All right, well, I will start us off with a few questions, and then after that, we'll open up for audience questions, so be thinking of something you might like to ask. So the first question I have is for all of you. So can each of you tell me what first interested you in sound in film?
So I got started doing audio theater as a offshoot of a improvisational theater group I was in college, and when we were working on that, the Apocalypse Now documentary Hearts of Darkness had just come out, and so they showed how they did how they made all the sounds. One of the things they mentioned was someone was in charge of the boat, doing all the sounds for the boat. They took one of those PT boats to Skywalker Sound and just threw empty cartridges at it and moved everything around. That was just fascinating to me, that you would take the real thing somewhere and record everything. And that film, the sound of it obviously was very had a huge impact on film sound in general. But that was the first time that the real technical aspect of film sound really captured my imagination, because you could really you could tell that that's what they were. You could kind of tell that that's what they were doing, but to actually see them in the documentary move things around and capture all the sound from multiple angles with multiple microphones, there was so much craft going into it. It was really astonishing. So,
for me, it was the introduction of music and how that tied in. My dad was a structural and mechanical engineer growing up, and he actually got me involved with playing around with analog tape really early as a young kid. But the musical tie-in for me, and what really got me interested in how can I capture this stuff and make use of it, was I was really into this animated Chipmunks TV show as an elementary school kid, and I loved the theme song. And the biggest thing that attracted me, and I'm sure this was the case for a lot of kids my age, was the voice of the Chipmunks themselves, which I knew from playing around with tape with my dad was, this thing where they had recorded it and sped it up. But I loved the theme song, and I wanted to capture it. My parents had gotten me a tape player recorder, and it had these two jacks on the top of it, and one of them said phones, where you'd plug in your headphones, and the other one said input/mic. And we didn't have any microphones, but I knew that sound came out of my headphones when it was plugged into this one jack. And I figured, well, maybe I could get sound to go back in if I plugged in the headphones to the other jack. And I took the left channel headphone, and back then it was back when we had a television screen, and then there was that one speaker on the right side of the screen with the little slats and the molded plastic. And I held the cup of the loudspeaker up against the TV. And it took me 2 days of trying to get this right, because first of all, I had to test my theory. So I held it up there, plugged into the mic input, waited for the show to come on, and then bam, hit record on the tape player. And it worked, sort of. I was excited because I was actually able to record something, but it was really quiet, and the fidelity wasn't very good. So the next day, I came home from school, and I grabbed it, and I pushed it really, really hard up against the TV and cranked the volume way, way, way up and turned the input gain all the way up on the tape recorder, and I actually got a halfway decent sounding recording of it. So it was sort of my way to capture, and then I could go listen back to it anytime I wanted instead of having to wait until the next day to get off the school bus and come running home to catch the show. So finally I could capture something and have it available whenever I wanted it.
So I suppose my dirty little secret is when I was a little kid, I didn't watch a lot of movies. We watched the same movie a lot of times, mind you, I think I saw The Sound of Music about 1,000 times, and I saw Peter Pan with Mary Martin about 1,000 times, and Fantasia about 1,000 times, and that was my oeuvre. And I didn't watch a lot of other movies until I reached, middle school kind of age. And my dad had the old VHS Star Wars trilogy, which I thought was phenomenal. So I watched the whole thing. And then my dad thought it would be fun because we were going to Washington, D.C. to visit a cousin. And the National Air and Space Museum had a Star Wars exhibit. So he took me. And it was about Joseph Campbell and the Hero with 1,000 Faces, and there was a lot about the movie. And then we got to this little bit in the middle about the sound design. And I don't know why I didn't watch a lot of movies as a kid. I kind of suspect it's because I took it all real seriously. I did not struggle with suspension of disbelief. I distinctly remember being rather young and sobbing rather hysterically at Bambi. Not when Bambi's mom starts sleeping. No spoilers here. But at the end, I started sobbing and couldn't stop because it was so happy. And they finally ended up being happy at the end. And I just took it so seriously. So I think maybe that's why I didn't watch a whole lot of movies. So as far as I was concerned, Star Wars was great. And this sounded great because they'd gotten microphones and dangled them in space and had the TIE fighters go past. And they started talking about how the TIE fighters sound was recorded through a combination of an elephant trumpet and the sound of a car on wet pavement, making the shh sound along with the rrrr sound. And then they played you the sound, and I was like, I hear both of those things. That is so cool. And I never went back. I've always noticed I get very excited about sound in film, particularly in the science fiction genre when they're really creating something new.
Thank you, Al. So the film doesn't get too much into the details of music as part of film sound, but several people in the film credit music, specifically the musique concrète and the avant-garde composer John Cage, as influences on other aspects of film sound. So Jessica, could you talk a little bit about these 20th century music styles and how and why they've had such an impact on innovation in sound design? And then from there, Tony, if you could talk about how you've been influenced by music in your role as a Foley artist.
Yes, that's a great question. Musique concrète, as opposed to musique électronique, what you really see in the 20th century is all of a sudden the electronics opens up this world of sound. And as a musicologist, I can listen to a lot of different pieces from 1900 and earlier, and I can give you a really good ballpark about when it was created. And everything from 1900 on, it starts to get a little murkier. Because what happens in the 20th century, and when I taught music history, I said the thing that makes 20th modern music unique is the eclecticism. All of a sudden, everybody starts branching out and thinking about how do we break the rules? How do we make music in new and beautiful ways that no one's ever heard of before? So it means abandoning a lot of these ideas about tonality and form and some other complicated things. But then you get someone like John Cage who says, hey, this is gorgeous sound all around us, what we get into this sound design, and the musique concrète, which takes recordings of real sounds, musicians or nature or people talking, and then uses electronics to manipulate that sound. So for instance, if I got the sounds of 20 different people laughing, ha, 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 and then put it all together with a rhythm and tone and made a whole piece of music out of it that's, recognizably musical. That would be an example of musique concrète. So I think the idea of, art in the 20th century really reaching for anything makes it work so that you can the brain is opened up to think, well, if I want, the sound of a lightsaber, what does that sound like? You have to invent it from nothing and going out and looking in places you wouldn't have looked before.
So my influence, musical influences on me, probably the biggest musical influence on me in general is Frank Zappa. Partly because of the eclecticism, partly because he worked tirelessly on his own schedule and was always working on 16 different projects at once. He also played around a lot with not so much standard time signatures, but just time in general. Carving up compositions were just involved carving up time, but not so much using musical blocks of time. He also liked to play with dialogue, with people's voices, play them backwards and forwards. Just interesting recording techniques, interesting ways of producing albums using sounds that aren't traditionally music, whether those are electronic or acoustic. Having people stick their heads inside a piano and read lines of dialogue, that sort of thing, and then turn that into music. The idea too that things don't have to be, or music doesn't have to be beautiful to be appreciated, or it doesn't have to have a traditionally beautiful aesthetic to be effective, or to be appropriate for what you're using. I also wanted to mention along the lines of John Cage, and something that's kind of implied in the sort of wheel of production that everybody that they talk about in the movie is silence is a very important, and not specifically the lack of any sound, but things like ambiances where you sort of let the room do the talking and let the ambience of the room do the storytelling. I think of two examples in 2001 where there's no sound in space. Like all the ships are moving around, but you don't hear you don't hear the rockets or anything like that. And most recently, in The Last Jedi, when the Star Destroyer gets split in half, there's this beautiful moment of just complete silence where all the sound is sucked out of the soundtrack, and you have just the pure image of and they had to put up warnings in theaters to let people know, hey, there's actually a moment of silence. It's not a mistake. It's actually, it's supposed to be there. And I thought that was a great artistic decision that doesn't get made in a movie like that very often, to just cut the sound completely and just not be there. So
I want to go back a little bit to something you touched on, Jessica. So one thing that I really hadn't thought about before was that you can't just record the sound and have it sound right and make the right impact. So Jamie, would you be able to talk about the technological reason why things don't just sound the way they sound, and what are the technical limitations, and how do you overcome those limitations when capturing and processing sound?
Sure. It's so funny, going out and doing some sound capture for Foley and things like that myself. You're always shocked after you kind of come back and you listen, you marry it with the image, how underwhelming things can be really regularly. And I'll never forget when I found out how this commercial was made, but back when I think I was in like middle school at the time, there used to be this great television ad for Washington apples, and there was this big golden delicious apple and black background, and this woman would bite into the apple, and it was almost semi-slow motion kind of thing, and you'd sort of see the little, the bits of juices jumping out, and you'd hear this fantastic, like, bright, crispy sound. You could just feel the texture. Your mouth would start watering as soon as you heard the sound, and it was this full frequency response, high frequencies, low frequencies, the pop when the section of apple sort of let go into your mouth. And if you'd gone out and stuck a microphone next to somebody biting into an apple, it just kind of would have been like, and that it would have been really underwhelming. I found out later on the way they recorded that sound is they actually took a 4x8 foot sheet of 3/4 inch thick plywood and folded it in half in a sound recording studio. And they did this with several sheets in a row until they got just the right sound or combination of sounds. But I mean, talk about one tiny little sound with someone's mouth, but creating an effective tool for the advertisement to make a believable, super real kind of sound took this enormous sheet of wood and plywood being cracked in half to be able to create it. So, sorry, you want to add?
I'd like to add. Are you done? No, sorry. I'd like to add that one of the things is about the texture. When he's talking about that texture, when you see things, you're seeing them, you can hear them, and that can help you experience it. But when you bite into an apple, for instance, you're feeling that crack of the skin and the crispness and the juiciness. And even though you don't hear it, you kind of hear it in your. I'm sorry, James is gonna have to talk about hearing it in your bones. But you kind of hear it in your head, right? It sounds like that a little bit in your head, the way it sounds. But then if you just record it to an outsider, it's not the same. So part of what you're doing is making it sound the way it feels like it should sound, and the way the texture that you would feel. The example I give is if you pick up sand in a movie, And somebody lets the sand run through their fingers and it goes shh. Does sand do that in real life? Not when I do it. But it makes it so that you can almost feel the sand running through your own fingertips. You can feel that texture.
Wind. Wind doesn't make any noise unless it's blowing against something else. So anytime wind happens in a movie or in radio, anytime you hear wind, it's a fabricated hyperreal sound. Unless it's blowing through a window or something where it's actually making friction. So yeah, there's a lot of things that it doesn't really sound like that. You're creating a hyperreal sound.
So going off of that, Tony, how did you learn to overcome that fact that things just don't sound the way they sound? And do you just troubleshoot every time until you get it right? Or do you kind of go in there and finally I know how to trick the system?
If you can't, well, almost always you start out with the real thing. You start out with the apple and get as close and take a big bite and see what that sounds like. And like you say, rarely does the real thing actually sound like it sounds like in your head, or sound like what you want it to sound like in somebody else's head. And so yeah, it's a lot of experimentation and working with different materials to eventually work your way up to the big 4x8 sheet of plywood. And also working with different microphones, different distance from the mic. Yeah, that's just a lot of different materials and different microphones, and also different. I find too that a lot of times it's not just the one sound. You usually have to record 2 or 3 things and put them all together or layer them on top of each other to get the weight or heft of something, or to get the texture of something. It's usually not. It might not be just the sheet of plywood. It might be the plywood plus an actual apple. Maybe those 2 things together will give you that head feel that you're going for.
I would just add to what Tony says. Part of this is art and part of this is science. And I think the science side, where you can anticipate, is one small thing, just microphone choice, right? Picking the right tool. We often, as audio engineers, we talk about choosing microphones like choosing paintbrushes. Or for a painter, do I need to create something wide and smooth, or narrow and sharp and precise? And so just choosing the right microphone to marry with that sound, anticipating, I need this to be really big and boomy, or I need it to be really crisp and bright sounding. So you make that choice first, and then you marry it with whatever the thing is that you're going to break or tear or rub together to create whatever that sound is that you need to fabricate.
So I also think it's really fascinating that in addition to that, working with the technology, you're also, as a sound effects artist, you're having to be hyper aware of the way that an audience is going to perceive it, and be able to influence our emotions and our opinions as much really as an actor would, or as the music would. And earlier this week you had mentioned to me that it's taught you how to move like different people. So I wondered if you could talk more about that. How do you get the impact on the audience that you're looking for?
That's a really good question. So I do a lot of work live, do a lot of live performance situations. So you're an actor. I mean, you're acting if you're in a studio too, but in a live environment, you're just using just your body. You don't have a lot of technology between you and the audience. It's just microphones, and there's not a lot of mixing and editing that you can do in a live environment. So it's more of a using your body to sound like all these different objects or sound like all these different people. In a studio environment, again, there's more experimentation. You can do more takes and you can also do a lot of editing to take something that you've recorded, and you can kind of take some of the weight off and make it sound lighter, or you can add weight to it and make it sound heavier. Obviously you can add volume to make it sound bigger, or make it sound small by turning the volume down. So those are tricks or techniques to sort of change the size of something. You add a lot of bottom end, you add a lot of bass to something to make it sound massive, or make it sound like it's moving slowly. I always talk about footsteps, and how if the footsteps are loud and slow, it's a very large person. If they're quick and light, it's a very small person. And I will put on heels and run around in high heels to make it sound like someone who's running around in high heels. But there are ways that you can that you can do that, by quicker steps, or instead of the heel toe, it's kind of all in one. You do a lot of observation of how people move in real life. How does the foot approach stairs? Are you going up or are you coming down? And it sounds different if you're going upstairs versus going down. So you just pay attention to how things sound in real life, and then you can replicate them in a studio or a live environment.
All right. Well, I know I can ask some more questions, but I want to give you all the opportunity to ask your questions as well. So does anybody have any questions for our three panelists?
I would say Jessica made a good point about that earlier in that, oh, I'm sorry, you have to repeat the question.
Yes, I was just going to repeat to make sure everyone heard. So the question is about what if you don't agree with someone else when you're working on the sound in a film? What sounds right? What happens there? So, sorry, go ahead.
What Jessica brought up earlier, talking about the textural element of what it is, I think when that gets right, what you see and what you hear, it just feels right. And you know when you hit on it. And it's usually there's not a lot of doubt or argument to be had at that point. When it fits, you know it fits.
No, I think that's, we've been talking a lot about experimentation, and experimentation is usually a collaborative venture between the performer and the listener, sort of like a performer and an audience, although the audience is ultimately the director, who is sort of making the final creative call on whether it's right or not. And sometimes what's right in that scene might not be right for the scene that's coming next, or the scene that's come before. So you might need to back it off a little more, and maybe not as loud, or maybe not as much, or maybe more. So.
Yeah, there are a lot of stories, particularly in science fiction, of someone comes in and they're like, oh, I think this is the sound of the robot. And the director's like, no, that's not what the robot sounds like. We'll leave it in until you come up with something better. And then once they live with it, they like it. Or they come up with something different. And I think what you find a lot of times is that a sound designer, a sound editor, will come back with several different options. So for instance, for Edward Scissorhands, I happen to know that Johnny Depp's scissor hands were mechanical. So they made sounds like this, zoop, 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 zoop. And that's not what they wanted it to sound like. They wanted it to sound like scissors. So I believe it was the Foley artist in this instance, went in with a bunch of different pairs of scissors, went in and got different sounding pairs of scissors. I was like, okay, director, you have a strong opinion on how this should sound. So she played for Tim Burton. She's like, all right, scissors number 1, scissors number 2, scissors number 3. And he eventually narrowed it down to 2, and then she picked 1 because it was the most comfortable to do it. But so sometimes you'll have, as with any artistic choice, people will have strong opinions and have strong varying opinions. But I think a lot of times they end up settling with something that feels right once you've lived with it for a while.
I'll add, I auditioned for a show I was doing, I auditioned about 15 different kinds of plastic, cellophane, to do live fire. And the best cellophane you can use to do fire as a sound effect in a live situation is the plastic off a pack of cigarettes. That's the one. It's great. You can just kind of crumple it. You can only do it about 10 performances before you need a new one. But yeah, and who would think that in theater you would find someone that has a box of cigarettes with the plastic still on it? So.
Great question. Thank you. Did you have a question? Yeah, so the question is about how this movie sounded specifically in IU Cinema and how they spend all this time working on the sound and can't really have control about on how it sounds out in the world. So, um, Jessica, would you maybe like to talk about what's so special about the sound
Sure.
here?
So at IU Cinema, we have fantastic sound. So the speakers are all around you. They're just hidden to kind of keep the aesthetic. So we've got the behind the screen, we have left, center, and right channels, as you heard when they were talking about mono versus stereo. You heard it open up into the sound. We've got the subwoofers up there. We have some surround speakers back here behind these light sconces. And then in the back behind this lattice work, so we're capable in 7.1, so they were talking about 6-channel sound. That's expanded to 8-channel sound, which is where we're at. So there were a couple of times I was sitting in this movie and they were talking about the surround sound and people were talking over there and I was like, why are these people talking over in the, oh, right, sorry, that's the movie. And one of the best sounding movies I heard in here, and I told you how I take movies real seriously. I don't watch horror movies for that reason. The Exorcist. I saw The Exorcist in here, only I stood in the back because I wanted to be able to leave when I got scared, which I did several times. I'm a sensitive soul. But there's one distinctive part where 2 priests, I think, are talking in the middle of a college quad. And these 2 little voices came from back here, 2 college students talking real loud. It was super annoying. And I swear the whole audience was like, oh, college students. No, it was the movie. That's what a college quad sounds like. And so that is very special. And I can't tell you how many times I've been in a movie theater, and I'm sure my colleagues here will back me up, where the movie theater does not have the quality of sound that perhaps the sound designer would have wished.
I thought you were going to talk about THX standards.
Oh,
So,
we're THX certified here at the Indiana University Cinema, and basically it means a lot of things, but the sound is perfectly calibrated here. The screen is the right size for the space, the sound is good everywhere. There is not really a bad sounding seat in the house. I have some opinions on some better sounding seats, like in the center, but everything's going to sound good. Everything's going to sound the way we could have a director here for a sold-out screening and put them in any one of the seats and not worry that it's not going to sound right or look right, because we have been very carefully calibrated and certified that that is the case. Is that fair? Yeah, okay, good.
I would just add to that, there are a couple of different standards out there, and if you really want to get into the weeds with audio engineers, we can talk about, how well things translate and how controlled that is from one space to another. But standards are a good thing, and so having a THX certified system means there's sort of a minimum quality, there's a minimum ability for a mix that's done in, an LA soundstage to be able to translate to this theater, which is a totally different floor plan, totally different dimensions in the room, totally different volume of space and volume of air, but it's going to translate reasonably well to a wide range of different spaces that are out there. THX, it's a bit of maybe a money grab, but they go out and they evaluate each of those spaces to make sure it's up to a certain minimum standard. D-Box has their own standard. Atmos has their own standard. There are a number of these that exist out there. So, but the fact that, everyone's trying to get as even an experience from one room to another and having things translate and sound as equal as they possibly can in different spaces, I think it's a really good thing to help solve that problem, because audio engineers all the time are concerned about, oh, but how is my mix going to translate to, someone listening on headphones or a different pair of headphones, which can be dramatically different in and of itself, or the car, or in someone's living room, or outside where there are no walls, all these kinds of things. So it is a problem, but standards help.
And can I also say soundproofing is another important element that gets ignored in the movie watching experience. If you've ever been in a movie theater and you're watching a really silent movie and King Kong's going on next door and you can hear it, or you hear the sirens go past as someone, fainted, and needed an ambulance. One of the THX certification things is that you can only have certain levels from the outside at certain hertz, and it's very complicated. But the idea is that there's very little from the outside that's going to permeate in here and interfere with your movie-going experience.
Yeah, and I'll say I watched this movie twice on my computer before getting to watch it in here. And I actually learned more this third time watching it in here because they demonstrated so many different things with all of the different speakers that totally did not come through on my MacBook Air. So I really appreciated that. Yeah, right there. Really good question. So the question was how the workflow and the process differs with all the different types of sound you're recording, so voice or Foley or special effects, things like that.
Well, I can talk a little bit. So I would break that down into categories of, say, music recording versus sound effects recording and Foley recording, or dialogue for that matter. In order to put each of these sounds into its appropriate environment, often we have to do a lot artificially in the mix later on. So creating a reverb, creating a reverb that fits in a bedroom setting is very different from what you would do in a shower setting versus what you might do outside in the forest, which is not acoustically dead because there are little reflections that happen, off of trunks of trees and things of that sort. So often, certainly with dialogue, ADR, automatic dialogue replacement, which there's sort of nothing automatic about it at all, but it's recorded really dry in a very, very soundproofed and very acoustically absorbent space so that you have just the voice by itself. And then you can superimpose that reverb on it later to put it into a believable room like you see on screen. Now, some of it is recorded on set when you're lucky enough to have a quiet enough set where you can get away with that, which is why you have these boom mic operators trying to capture with a shotgun microphone, which is super, super hyper directional, and you're trying to only pick up that one voice, that kind of thing. Music, on the other hand, we might handle very differently. These orchestral scores that we hear, they're recorded on an orchestral soundstage, which is a large physical space. It's not acoustically dead. It definitely has, reflective surfaces on the walls, the floor, the ceiling, diffusion to help break up. If you've got parallel walls, you don't want to slap back echo between those parallel surfaces. It wants to feel more like an orchestral performance space. We'll probably add some more reverb in post as well to that to make it believable. But that's a very different acoustic environment from what you would record the dialogue in, for example.
I would say similar to what you're talking about, dialogue recording, or ADR, you want to record in a very dry environment. Foley, you want to record also in a very dry environment so that you can add anything you want to, add reverb, add echo, add any of those effects to it. In situations where you're field recording, though, you want to go to where the ambient sounds like where it will sound in the movie. So if you are, say, trying to record gunfire for gunshots that are happening outdoors, you're not going to try and record those in a studio and add reverb to them. You could, but it's hard to match. It's hard to match the natural ambience. It's hard to match it artificially. Hard to match a natural ambience artificially. So it's best if you can go to either someplace that's very similar, or go to that actual place later when there aren't people around and record the sound in that environment, in that same environment. And it's the same thing as when you're recording dialogue. Before and after you record dialogue somewhere, you record several minutes of room tone. So if you're recording tracks somewhere in a location, you're recording voice tracks. You usually, before you start recording any voice tracks, you set up. Everybody gets quiet. You set up your microphones. You record 5 minutes or so of just the ambience that's there. And then before you leave, and honestly, any other time you're there, you might record a few minutes here and there while you're in that location. And that's so you've got something. You've got that ambience. You can cover spaces. What was the Ordinary People, where they were talking about taking out all the pops and the planes and the traffic and whatnot. If you've got some room tone, you can use that room tone to cover up anything that has happened while you're recording the voice tracks.
I want to add to and point out what a painstaking process that alone can be. Trying to get silence or the ambient sound of a room. During recording sessions, I always make a habit of making everybody stop and shut up and breathe as quietly as they can for 2 minutes. And I'll record it two full minutes, which feels like about a week. in the middle of a high-paced recording session, just so I can be lucky enough to maybe get 6 or 7 seconds of even silence that I can use as room tone later on to edit in, because you don't realize how many tiny things there are that infiltrate. Even if you're out doing a field recording in, a fairly remote environment these days, air travel, there's so much population on the planet, trying to get to these quiet places or these natural environments, there's still unnatural things that pop in so frequently. It can be really hard to get that really clean ambient sound.
You always have to remember to turn off the air handling, turn off the air conditioner,
geez.
turn off the heater, turn off the air conditioning, everybody sweats, turn off the heat, everybody freezes.
Yeah, don't open your mouth. This kind of drives us all nuts. I not to bash on anybody, but I would encourage you. You forget there are certain elements that are so basic, and I think ambient noise is one of those. Nobody really thinks about ambient noise and doing it well. But if you forget it, it sounds real weird. And there's a movie called Birdemic, which many of you may have heard. And if you go and look on YouTube for a diner scene, it's an example of, it's kind of a midnight cult movie that they didn't quite get the ambient noise for the entire scene. So it sounds different every time there's a cut. So you'll see the waitress, and the room sounds like, and then you go to the other guy, and the room sounds like, and it's really, really freakishly weird. And I like to use that one as a great example of how sound design, really great sound design, might not get noticed. Certainly competent sound design is not going to get noticed, but when you forget some of these little details that are hard to get, it really is hard to get the room noise and layer everything on top of it, all of a sudden you don't, it just sounds so weird. You just can't live in that space. Birdemic. Oh yeah, there's a fun scene where they fight off birds with coat hangers. It's a very unusual low budget film.
Sort of to be case in point, I often do this with my students in class. In fact, I think I have one of my A100 students sitting back there. But for 3 seconds, let's just do this as a quick experiment to sort of make the point. So everybody take a deep breath, and you're going to hold it for 3 seconds and just listen to the room itself. Now we think of this as being a really controlled, very quiet room, but as soon as we're all silent, we stop talking and you stop breathing, all of a sudden the HVAC noise or the hiss of the loudspeakers becomes a really noticeable thing in this room. You've probably, for many of you, you've probably never noticed it before until you have that moment of silence to realize how loud silence can be.
Yeah, I definitely had not thought about that aspect of sound design before. That was so interesting. So just to close us off, and Jessica already answered this a little bit with the ambient noise, but for you two, next time we all go to a film, what else should we listen for to be more educated about hearing film sound? Yes, you may.
So there's a thing I've noticed quite a bit recently in sort of tentpole franchise movies. I'm sure it happens in other places too, but I've only become really aware of it recently, where it's a way of fixing a plot point that maybe you didn't. Maybe this dialogue wasn't written on the first pass through the movie, and after it's been focus group, they've figured out what they need to add to change a plot point. And what they'll do is they'll drop in footage of someone with their back to the camera. They've been doing these A/B shots where you see the back of someone and someone is talking, and then they flip it, they reverse it, and you see the other person talking to them. And so what they'll do is they'll drop in one scene of someone with their back to the camera, and the other person is not talking; they're just listening. And then they'll ADR that actor with their back to the camera. They'll ADR a line of exposition. Just a one quick line, oh, he wasn't on that ship. Or there's one little piece of, oh, I see, oh, we forgot to shoot something, and so we'll fix that with a line of dialogue. And I've seen that in maybe 5 or 6 fairly recent films where they just dropped in this one scene, and it's not glaring. It may need to be pointed out to you, but that's one trick. And there's something that I have seen this for 20 years now. I've heard this for 20 years. It's the same door. It's off the Hollywood Edge demo sound effects CD. I've been hearing it in The Simpsons. I hear it in Law and Order SVU. I've heard it in Breaking Bad. I've heard it in just movie after movie. It's the same.
Not to call anyone out.
Yeah, not to call anyone out. But it's Hollywood Edge demo track 12. It's door, open and close, wooden, and it's this little. The door opens, little sticky open, clunk clunk, and it's the same door every time I hear it. It completely pulls me out of whatever movie, TV, whatever. It's mostly TV. It's mostly TV shows, but I have heard it in movies too. And so that's something to. The more movies you watch, the more things you will pick up on this. You will pick up on the same, especially things that are maybe not top shelf material, but movies that use the same, they'll recycle the same sound effects. It's like the Western that they showed that used the same gunshot for every gun that's fired in the movie, whether it's a pistol or a rifle or whatever, and it's the same gunshot used, same gunshot ricochet every time for every shot, no matter if it ricochets or not.
So that might be the cheap out end of the spectrum. On the opposite end of the spectrum, I think of the Wilhelm scream. So where it's a nod to sort of movie soundtracks past.
Okay, so I don't want you to think about anything about sound when you're watching movies. Just enjoy the movies. But here's what I want you to come out of here understanding, which is the reason I'm really actually very excited that we showed this particular movie. Every single blickety-blank year, we get to Oscar season, and everybody in my Oscar pool and everybody on Brutally Honest, Oscar ballots, whatever, says, oh, I don't know the difference between sound editing design and sound mixing, so I just vote for whatever sounds good. You all now know what the difference is. This movie was 90% about sound editing and design. So that is what they are talking about, the creation of those sounds, the recording of those sounds. The sound mixing, they talked about a little bit, right? That's the part about what volume levels are you doing? What are you kind of cutting out? What is almost subliminal in the sound? You know, that ambient noise maybe is just not, you can't understand it, but it's there. How do you do that? That is a very important and artistic job, as well as where are things going to be placed in the surround sound if the movie's in surround sound. You all know the difference, and now you can vote on both of those categories separately and educatedly.
Great. Well, thank you again all so much for taking the time to be here, and thanks to Science on Screen. Thank you all for staying and listening to this wonderful discussion. We really appreciate it, and I hope you all have a great night.